نحن جند الله جند الوطن ادعى داعي الفداء لن نخن.
We always hear the same message lately, both in pro-Western media outlets and among Sudanese youth. When they lift sanctions on Sudan, our economy will take off. Our country is poor because of economic sanctions. The Westerners will help us develop once economic sanctions are lifted, etc. An understanding of the nature of Western sanctions, the Sudanese economy, and Western policy objectives paints a very different picture. First, a look at sanctions. Some countries under Western economic sanctions include North Korea, Iran, Russia, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, China, Turkey, Myanmar, Belarus, Syria, Nicaragua, Cambodia, Laos, and many more. Many of these countries are sanctioned far more aggressively by the West than Sudan, but economically are doing much better. None of them have better ratios of natural resources to the size of their population than Sudan. To take a key indicator of development, here are the adult literacy rates in countries targeted by Western sanctions. Again, many are sanctioned far more harshly than Sudan, but all are much better off. Sudan's economic difficulties are not related to economic sanctions in any way, but to severe corruption both under the Omar Al Bashir government and today. Many countries such as Russia and North Korea have actually improved their economies due to sanctions, which have cut reliance on Western products and stimulated domestic manufacturing and import substitution. Sanctions on these two countries have been far harsher than those against Sudan. The West needs Sudan to believe that it cannot survive without them. But what the Koreans, the Russians, and others have shown is that Sudan very easily can. The country has a small population and one of the greatest resource endowments on the planet. Sudan still has access to the vast majority of the world economy, including many more reliable trading partners. And if the economy is properly managed, then sanctions keeping Western interests out of the country can actually be beneficial. Sudan has access to trade with China, South Korea, Japan, North Korea, Taiwan, India, Indonesia, West Africa, South Africa, Arabia, Iran, Israel, Latin America, Russia, and Central Asia, to name just a few examples. The Western centrism of those who say Sudan needs the West to have trade and development is quite ridiculous. For a prosperous, stable, dignified, and independent Sudan, say no to Western centrism, say yes to freedom and rationality. Looking at the world's leading economies, the vast majority are non-Western and are open for trade and investment with Sudan. It's not 1997 anymore. Pretty much everything the Europeans and Americans can offer today, the East Asians, Russians, and Israelis can offer at far better value. The world's top smartphones, electronics, ships, cars, computer chips, construction firms, and pretty much everything else comes from China, Japan, and Korea, not from Western economies. Semiconductors, shown here for example, are at the heart of the global economy and are overwhelmingly produced in East Asia, where the world's most competitive and healthy economies are located. One of the few things the West does lead in is debt. The most indebted economies are almost all Western. Western economies are increasingly uncompetitive, and in Europe in particular they rely on massive privileges from trade with Africa to survive. Without the benefits of unequal trading relationships with Africa, France and many other European nations would be relegated to third world status. Expert Malence Bart Williams elaborates on this here.
The perception is that a healthy and thriving Africa would not disperse its resources as freely and cheaply, which is logical. Of course, it would instead sell its resources at world market prices, which in turn would destabilize and weaken Western economies, established on the post-colonial free meal system. The French Treasury, for example, is receiving about $500 billion year in, year out in foreign exchange reserves from African countries based on colonial debt they forced them to pay. Former French President Jacques Chirac stated in an interview recently that we have to be honest and acknowledge that a big part of the money in our banks comes precisely from the exploitation of the African continent. In 2008, he stated that without Africa, France will slide down in the rank of a third world power.
The European economies today are very far from healthy, and they desperately need privileged access to Africa's resources to prop them up. If history and the world economy teach us anything, the Westerners will take far more out of Sudan than they will ever put in. The beginnings of exploitation are already evident, from demands to try the former president in a European court to requests for compensation for Al-Qaeda attacks from the 1990s, which were not committed by Sudanese nationals. Compensation paid to the United States will only be the beginning of Sudan's subsidizing of Western economies. By making Sudan a Western client state, it will be ensured that the bulk of the benefits from exploiting Sudan's resources will go to the Western world, and not to the Sudanese people. Similar forms of Western exploitation of African nations can be seen across the continent, with Francophone West Africa being a prime example. Despite the shortcomings of Omar Al Bashir's government, Sudan's living standards remained well above those of many Western client states in Africa, such as South Sudan. Branding Sudan a state sponsor of terror is just one of many pretexts used by the West to put the country under sanctions. Others have included economic relations with Syria, economic relations with Russia, economic relations with North Korea, economic relations with Iran, buying military equipment from Russia, China, Korea, or Iran, domestic constitutional reforms, allegations of human rights abuses, often fabricated, and pretty much doing anything that upsets Western interests. The United States have even sanctioned Venezuela for rewriting their own constitution because the rewrite did not suit Western interests. How dare they govern themselves in a way the West doesn't agree with? In the West's attempt to impose its will on the world, some of the countries threatened with sanctions in recent years have included Russia, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, Venezuela, Serbia, Cuba, Egypt, China, Lebanon, Turkey, Cambodia, Myanmar, Iraq, Belarus, North Korea, Syria, Turkmenistan, Nicaragua, Iran, Laos, and Malaysia. By blindly worshipping all that is Western at the expense of the nation and its dignity, and believing that the nation's fate relies on the West, it will be ensured that Sudan has no hope of an independent and prosperous future. It is important not to assume that the only alternative to the corruption and stagnation of the Omar Al Bashir and Ghafar Nimeri years is Westernisation. The West today remains in serious decline, and everything the Western world can offer Sudan, the Chinese, Koreans, Russians, Israelis, and others can offer on far better terms. As is covered quite well in a number of works on the nature of Western policy towards the non-Western world, Sudan can't expect positive change by exposing itself to their influence. Ultimately, no government which has surrendered its country's sovereignty to Western interests and adopted a Western-style system has successfully developed their country. Those non-Western countries such as China, North Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, which did modernize, did so under systems very different from that the West is pushing on Sudan today. For more information on Sudan's future, Western sanctions and Western policy, please see below.